February 22, 1944. Over central Germany, deep in the bomber stream. The B-24 shuddered as the formation tightened, every crewman locked into position while the mission pushed deeper toward its target. Inside the waist compartment, the American gunner steadied himself beside the open window, his hands wrapped around the cold grips of the .50 caliber machine gun. The bomber vibrated with the constant tension of engines running at full power, each second drawing them farther into hostile airspace. Then he saw them. 6 Ju-88s sliding out from the distant haze, not drifting, not scouting, but lining up with deliberate precision. Their wings leveled. Nose angles held steady. Approach disciplined and unmistakably lethal. They were coming directly for the Liberators. The gunner didn't call out. He reacted. His body moved before thought fully formed. He swung the heavy gun across the frame, locked onto the lead attacker, and opened fire. The first burst tore across the empty sky, a stream of bright tracers reaching out toward the oncoming German fighters just as they committed to their attack run. And that single instant, the reflex of one waist gunner, would decide whether this B-24 survived the next 30 seconds of the mission. American heavy bombers entered 1944 with a clear objective: push deeper, strike harder, and dismantle the industrial network that kept the German war machine alive. The B-24 Liberator, fast, long-ranged, and carrying a heavy payload, became one of the central tools of that strategy. Its wide wings, Davis airfoil, and powerful engines made it ideal for long-distance missions across hostile territory. But every crewman understood a simple truth: range meant nothing if the bomber could not defend itself once the Luftwaffe found them. On February 22, 1944, the Liberators assigned to this raid flew as part of a larger U.S. bomber stream pushing toward high-value industrial targets deep inside central Germany. Formation discipline was everything. Position meant survival. A tight formation maximized overlapping fire, but turbulence, altitude shifts, and the natural spread of aircraft sometimes forced small gaps to appear. Enemy fighters looked for those gaps, especially the coordinated twin-engine crews flying the Ju-88. Inside the B-24, each crewman performed a job with absolute focus. The cockpit handled navigation and throttle management. The nose compartment scanned for high-angle threats. Top and tail turrets covered vertical approaches. And in the waist, gunners occupied one of the most demanding roles of all. Their field of fire was wide, but so were their responsibilities. They had to identify approaching fighters, track their closing angles, and lay down fire with speed and accuracy under constant vibration. For the waist gunner in this Liberator, the routine of vigilance had already stretched for hours. The bomber's engines maintained a steady but slightly strained tone, typical of long-range crews at the altitude required for the mission. He felt each adjustment in formation spacing, every moment when the bomber lifted slightly or dipped to keep alignment. The waist compartment gave him a clear view of the bombers ahead and behind, forming a staggered geometric pattern of silver shapes pushing through enemy territory. The gunner had flown missions before, but none eased the tension. Experience sharpened awareness, not comfort. He knew the Ju-88 was not just another enemy aircraft. It was a coordinated attacker built specifically for bomber interception. Its twin engines gave it endurance, its crews trained to strike with discipline, and its armament allowed it to engage from multiple angles. Waist gunners often bore the brunt of their attacks, especially when the German pilots attempted to flank the formation from low diagonal approaches. American crews had been briefed thoroughly. Luftwaffe activity increased in this region. Ju-88 groups had adapted their tactics, using multiplane assaults to overwhelm isolated bombers or punch into formations showing even slight weaknesses. Intelligence officers explained how the German pilots coordinated their attack runs, one element distracting the formation, another pressing from the blind spots, and a final group committing to a simultaneous strike designed to saturate defensive fire. The waist gunner absorbed all of it. Not passively, but with the understanding that his role could decide seconds that determined whether the bomber stayed airborne or ended in a burning descent. As the Liberator moved deeper into Germany, the horizon changed. Contrails faded. Shadows advanced across the landscape far below. Radio chatter narrowed into clipped, functional exchanges. A mission could move from routine to lethal with no warning, an accepted fact in American bomber operations. The gunner scanned continuously. Far angles. Low approaches. Movement between the shimmering haze and the trailing bombers. His job demanded this constant attention. One moment of distraction could allow enemy fighters the opening they needed. And then, as the formation adjusted altitude to align with the final phase of the mission, he detected a shift, a subtle disturbance at first, then a clear pattern forming. Far behind the trailing element, shapes appeared. Not drifting, but moving with intent. 6 dark silhouettes emerging in measured intervals. He immediately understood what they were. Not scouts. Not lone hunters. A coordinated strike group. 6 Ju-88s aligning themselves with methodical precision, wings trimmed for a direct approach. The moment the gunner's eyes locked onto them, every detail of the briefing, every hour of practice, every instinct conditioned by training surged into the forefront of his mind. He was no longer scanning. He was preparing. This wasn't a random encounter. It was the beginning of the attack. And the waist compartment he occupied would become one of the first defensive lines in the seconds ahead. The 6 Ju-88s maintained their distant alignment with a discipline that revealed their intent long before they accelerated. They were part of a Luftwaffe tactic refined after countless confrontations with American bomber formations, a multi-vector assault designed to drain defensive fire, confuse gun positions, and overwhelm any bomber that drifted even slightly from its protective overlap. These were not casual interceptors. They were configured specifically for anti-bomber combat. Hard-hitting nose cannons. Underwing gun pods. Coordinated attack procedures drilled into crews who understood the strengths and weaknesses of American heavy bombers. The waist gunner knew the pattern from intelligence briefings. Ju-88s approached from low quadrants, rising at angles that forced waist and belly gunners to divide their attention. Once they closed to firing range, they launched a concentrated burst meant to cripple engines, fuel systems, or the wing roots, anything that could turn a bomber into a falling mass of metal. The B-24's defensive layout made the waist positions crucial in this type of engagement. The open windows, the wind rushing through the compartment, the limited mobility caused by the oxygen lines and ammunition belts, all these factors shaped the gunner's ability to track incoming threats. But those same open windows offered clear, unobstructed fields of fire, allowing waist gunners to sweep large sections of sky with their .50 caliber machine guns. The formation around him tightened. The bombers ahead shifted subtly to maintain spacing, each crew aware of the danger growing behind them. A tight formation meant overlapping arcs of fire, the strongest defense American heavy bombers possessed against coordinated German attacks. Stray too far from formation and a bomber risked isolation. Stay too close and the defensive guns might blind one another. The pilots flew with precision, balancing these opposing risks as the threat closed in. Meanwhile, the Ju-88s advanced with increasing speed. Their formation wasn't rigid like the bombers. It flexed and adjusted based on angles, altitude, and the lead aircraft's command. Each German crew knew the plan. One pair would swing wide to the left, another to the right, and the final 2 would press directly toward the center of the bomber stream. The attack was designed to force B-24 gunners to split their focus, a psychological maneuver as much as a tactical one. Reports from previous missions described these assaults as moments of extreme compression. Time seemed to accelerate and collapse. A waist gunner's window filled with incoming metal, then emptied, then filled again from another direction. Each engagement demanded absolute presence of mind. The slightest hesitation allowed a Ju-88 to fire first, and a single cannon burst could bring catastrophic damage. The American gunner in this B-24 understood all of it. He had spent hours in gunnery training stateside, firing from moving platforms, judging angles relative to slipstream, and practicing the controlled bursts needed to maintain accuracy. But nothing matched combat. Nothing compared to watching real enemy fighters maneuver with lethal intent. One detail of the Ju-88's behavior stood out to him. The German pilots weren't speeding now, they were watching. Closing distance without committing. Evaluating the formation, identifying weak spots, waiting for turbulence to create just enough spacing to exploit. This patience was a signature trait of experienced Luftwaffe crews. The bomber stream continued forward, engines humming in the steady drone of synchronized power. The gunner shifted his weight, bracing himself as the plane vibrated with minute corrections. He kept his eyes fixed on the approaching shapes. He counted them again. 6. Still 6. Unbroken, unchanged. He tracked their angles, measured their distance, noted their altitude relative to the bomber's position. He wasn't calling them out because the formation had already reported enemy presence earlier in the mission. Every gunner was on alert. Every turret had begun its slow, steady rotation in preparation. But inside the waist compartment, he realized something no one else had yet seen. The German formation was adjusting again, this time with unmistakable purpose. The outer pair dipped slightly. The inner pair shifted downward. The lead two climbed just enough to create a staggered vertical approach. This wasn't observation anymore. It was alignment. A coordinated, 6-aircraft attack run, the kind designed to break an entire bomber position in seconds, was about to begin. And the waist gunner, with one open window and seconds to act, stood directly in their path. American bomber crews relied on discipline more than anything else when the enemy closed in. For the waist gunner, this discipline wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, internal, and constant. Every action inside that narrow compartment came from hours of repetition. The way he braced his boots against the metal ribs of the fuselage. The way he steadied the .50 caliber without overgripping. The way he scanned from horizon to mid-sky in smooth, predictable arcs. These weren't improvisations. They were reflexes developed from training that taught him one truth. A gunner survived by removing hesitation. As the Ju-88s moved into their assault pattern, discipline took over completely. He didn't allow his breathing to quicken. He didn't allow panic to distort the angles. He didn't shout prematurely and risk distracting the crew during a moment that required total focus. The bomber's survival depended on clarity, not noise. He kept his firing line clean, ensuring no friendly aircraft drifted into his arc. He checked the ammunition tray with a practiced glance, then settled his stance as the German fighters began their climb. Every motion he made in those early seconds narrowed the possible outcomes. A sloppy burst would reveal his position without disrupting the attack. An early trigger pull would waste the precious seconds before the fighters entered effective range. His discipline, built through countless hours of training, allowed him to wait, to watch, to choose the exact moment to strike. That moment was approaching fast. The Ju-88s were committed now. Their attack line was set, and the waist gunner's discipline, steady, unbroken, positioned him to act with decisive precision. Combat in the sky moved faster than the mind could comfortably follow. For waist gunners, success depended on recognizing momentum shifts in fractions of a second. The gunner inside the B-24 understood this better than most. As the 6 Ju-88s began accelerating, their formation tightening into a spear point, he felt the change through instinct alone. Momentum wasn't a metaphor. It was physics made lethal. The German fighters gained speed with every second, and the waist gunner knew that once they reached their firing line, the bomber would be subjected to a storm of 20mm cannon shells. The enemy's advantage was simple. They were moving, the bomber was not. That speed amplified every ounce of their firepower. But momentum worked both ways. The waist gunner used the bomber's slight drift, its vibration, and even the slipstream pouring through the open window to stabilize his aim. Every gust of wind was a factor. Every vibration transferred through the metal floor shaped the barrel's movement. He didn't fight these forces, he used them. He pressed the gun into the shoulder harness mount, allowing the natural sway of the aircraft to create a smoother arc. As the fighters closed, momentum shifted again. The Ju-88s had committed to speed, but in doing so, they surrendered flexibility. Their attack path had become predictable. Straight. Committed. Vulnerable for a sliver of time. The gunner recognized that sliver the moment the lead aircraft angled slightly upward, preparing to fire. Momentum surged toward the bomber, and that was exactly when he pulled the trigger, creating a counterforce meant to break the attacker's rhythm entirely. Distance determined everything in air combat. Too far, and even the heaviest machine gun bursts drifted into wasted space. Too close, and the bomber became an easy victim for cannon fire. Waist gunners had to thread that boundary perfectly, and the gunner in this B-24 understood his ranges with instinctive accuracy. The approaching Ju-88s began their run from well outside effective range. At that distance, firing would have been pointless. The waist gunner instead tracked each aircraft, watching how their silhouettes grew against the sky. As they approached the midpoint, he adjusted his lead angles. He didn't track their noses, he tracked their future positions, predicting where they would be by the time his rounds reached them. Distance wasn't just about measurement. It defined the psychology of the encounter. German pilots counted on waist gunners panicking early, wasting ammunition in desperate streams that failed to disrupt the attack. Many American gunners had made that mistake on earlier missions, firing at specks on the horizon instead of waiting until shapes turned into aircraft, and aircraft turned into threats. But not this one. He knew the exact distance where .50 caliber rounds maintained lethal force. He knew when the fighters would cross into the window of maximum damage. And he also knew that firing even 1 second too late would render all of it meaningless. When the Ju-88s hit that critical line, the narrow band where discipline, instinct, and calculation met, he locked his body, braced his legs, leaned into the wind, and committed his first burst. The distance was perfect. Inside the waist compartment, chaos pressed in from every direction. The roar of engines. The vibration of the airframe. The rush of freezing wind cutting through the open window. But despite all of it, the waist gunner operated within a world of controlled movements. Control meant resisting fear. It meant stabilizing the machine gun even as adrenaline pushed him toward overreaction. It meant understanding that gunnery wasn't about spraying fire into the sky, it was about directing force with intent. When the Ju-88s converged, he did not freeze. Nor did he rush. He tightened his stance, absorbed the movement of the aircraft through his legs and arms, and allowed his breathing to fall into a slow rhythm. His eyes tracked each enemy fighter not with desperation, but with a precision that bordered on calm. The German planes were fast, but they weren't unpredictable. Their angles, speed, and trajectory formed a pattern. Control came from recognizing that pattern and shaping his fire to exploit its weaknesses. His hands adjusted the elevation wheel. His fingertips steadied the butterfly triggers. His shoulder and hips aligned the weapon with geometric intention. Every part of his body worked together to create a stable firing platform in a violently unstable environment. And as the fighters dove toward the bomber stream, the gunner's sense of control became the decisive factor, the element that would transform a split-second reaction into a survival-defining action. Pressure inside a bomber didn't build gradually, it arrived all at once, compressing thought, sound, and awareness into a single point of focus. For the waist gunner, that point was the exact moment the Ju-88s committed to their attack run. The formation of 6 German aircraft was no longer maneuvering, no longer adjusting. They were accelerating directly toward the bomber stream, closing the distance with deadly certainty. Pressure didn't make his hands tremble. It sharpened them. It tightened his grip on the .50 caliber controls, aligned his shoulders, and forced his breathing into a controlled pattern. The gunner understood that in the next few seconds, the fate of his B-24, and perhaps the crews flying beside him, would hinge on how he handled this rising tension. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing in from all sides. If he missed, the German fighters would reach firing range unchallenged. If he fired early, he would waste ammunition needed for the decisive moment. If he hesitated, the Ju-88s would unleash a concentrated burst capable of tearing through engines, fuel tanks, or crew positions with catastrophic force. The pressure was immense, but it had a clarifying effect. It stripped away noise, fear, and distraction. It reduced the entire sky to angles, speeds, and trajectories. In that distilled environment, the waist gunner's focus became absolute. The Ju-88s bore down on the bomber stream, confident in their coordinated strike. Yet they had miscalculated one thing: how a single American gunner could transform crushing pressure into precise, decisive action. Timing was the invisible currency of aerial combat. Every burst, every adjustment, and every decision had to align with the enemy's movement in fractions of a second. The waist gunner understood this intimately. He had seen footage during training sessions showing how even a perfectly aimed burst could fail if the timing was off by a heartbeat. The air war rewarded those who acted not first, but at the exact right moment. The Ju-88s were closing fast now, their engines pushing them into the narrow corridor where they could unleash their heaviest firepower. The waist gunner watched the slight rise in the lead aircraft's nose, the pre-attack gesture that telegraphed the moment before cannon shells would be fired. This was the cue he had been waiting for. Timing meant allowing the fighters to cross just inside lethal range, but not so close that the bomber became a stationary target. It meant firing early enough to disrupt their approach, but not so early that the rounds dispersed harmlessly. As the first Ju-88 crossed the invisible threshold of effective distance, the gunner made his choice. He opened fire in a controlled burst, not a desperate spray. The timing was perfect. His tracers intersected the German fighter's path at the exact moment the pilot committed to the attack, forcing the Ju-88 offline before it could release its burst. That single exchange disrupted the entire formation sequence. The remaining fighters faltered, if only slightly, but in air combat, even a momentary hesitation created opportunity. Timing had shifted, and the waist gunner now held the advantage. Impact wasn't just the moment a round struck metal, it was the effect of that strike on everything around it. The waist gunner's first burst hit the lead Ju-88 with enough force to twist its trajectory, sending it sliding out of its attack line. That disruption rippled backward through the formation. Luftwaffe assaults depended on synchronized timing. Each fighter relied on the others to maintain pressure on multiple bomber positions simultaneously. When the first aircraft slipped out of alignment, the second shifted to compensate, and the third adjusted to avoid collision. In seconds, a clean, lethal formation became a fractured set of individual approaches. The waist gunner didn't need to see flames or debris to know the hit mattered. The very shape of the attack had changed. What had been a unified spear point was now a staggered cascade of fighters forced into reactive maneuvering. Impact also resonated inside the bomber. The moment the gunner's rounds struck home, the radio crackled with confirmations from nearby aircraft. Other gunners reported altered attack vectors. Pilots noted the shift in enemy momentum. The bomber stream was no longer waiting for impact, it was responding to it. And the gunner continued, adjusting his angle as another Ju-88 entered his firing lane. His second burst forced the attacker to drop away, its evasive roll breaking whatever remained of the Germans' coordinated assault. He wasn't merely defending his position anymore. He was unraveling the enemy's entire attack. Resolve was the final measure of a gunner's strength, not in muscle but in endurance. The fight wasn't over when the first fighter peeled away, nor when the second broke formation. The remaining Ju-88s were still closing in, and each one carried enough firepower to tear through a bomber's defenses in a single pass. Resolve meant staying locked into the gunner's stance even as fatigue set in from recoil. It meant keeping the weapon under control despite the vibration shaking through the metal frame. It meant refusing to look away from the sky, even for a moment, because that moment might be the one when an enemy burst reached the bomber's fuselage. He had to finish this. Every instinct told him the attack was weakened, but not broken. The Ju-88s were now acting individually, each pilot trying to salvage a firing solution from the disrupted run. The waist gunner tracked them systematically, responding to each shift with steady, unwavering commitment. His bursts became shorter, more deliberate. His angles more precise. He wasn't firing out of urgency, he was firing out of determination. Each decision reflected the simple truth that the bomber's survival depended on his persistence. And as the last of the Ju-88s abandoned its approach, rolling away with smoke trailing from its wing, the gunner finally allowed his muscles to relax. His resolve had held. The attack was broken. The bomber was still flying. The moment the first Ju-88 peeled away, trailing a thin line of smoke, the bomber stream shifted from anticipation into raw engagement. The waist gunner had triggered it, the opening fracture in what was meant to be a synchronized German strike. But breaking formation didn't end the threat. It intensified it. Because now the Ju-88s were acting independently, each one choosing its own attack vector. The second fighter swung hard to the right, rising into a shallow climb to get above the bomber's waist guns. From that angle, the pilot could unleash cannon fire downward into the B-24's wing root, one of the most vulnerable structural points on the aircraft. The waist gunner saw the move instantly. He pivoted the .50 caliber, feeling the heavy gun resist for a moment before swinging through the slipstream. He led the fighter by a full wingspan, tightened his breath, and fired a short, precise burst. The tracers arced upward, intersecting the enemy's path at the exact moment the Ju-88 leveled out. The rounds sparked across its fuselage, tearing small but critical holes near the engine cowling. The German aircraft jerked violently, banking harder than planned as the pilot fought to maintain control. The attack collapsed mid-run, forcing the fighter to dive away before it could fire a single shot. But the third and fourth Ju-88s were already committed. They came from below, the most dangerous angle for a B-24's defensive network. Waist gunners had limited sightlines downward, and belly turrets couldn't track fast enough when fighters climbed beneath the bomber's blind arc. The waist gunner dropped into a low crouch, angling his fire through the narrow lower portion of the window. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The German fighters rose like twin shadows, coming up in a steep ascent directly toward the bomber's underside. Their intent was unmistakable: strike the belly, cripple the bomb bay doors, and send the aircraft spiraling. The waist gunner didn't wait. He fired the moment their noses cleared the bottom of his frame. The .50 caliber roared inside the compartment, its recoil pushing a deep vibration through his ribcage. His first burst missed wide. The fighters were rising too fast, too steep. He adjusted instantly, swinging a half-degree left and lowering the angle. His second burst found its mark. The lead fighter shuddered as rounds punched into the glass nose. A flash erupted from the inside as the forward cannon mount detonated under the impact. The Ju-88 stalled mid-climb, dipped its nose, and fell away in a spiraling arc that carried it out of sight. But the fourth fighter surged past the wounded one, now dangerously close. For a split second, the waist gunners saw the unmistakable flare of the German cannon charging. He didn't think. He didn't breathe. He simply reacted. He slammed the .50 caliber upward and fired. The tracers ripped across the Ju-88's right wing, slicing through control surfaces and fuel lines. A spray of vapor trailed behind the fighter as it lurched sideways. The pilot tried to correct, but the aircraft rolled too far, then too fast, flipping into a sharp, uncontrolled dive. The gunner's chest tightened. For fighters down or driven off. Two still unaccounted for. Then the compartment shook. The fifth Ju-88 was already firing. A burst of 20mm cannon shells tore through the air just behind the B-24's tail assembly. The gunner felt the concussion in his bones, a deep, physical shockwave that rattled the metal around him. The German pilot had chosen a rear-quarter angle, attempting to slip between the tail gunner's field of fire and the waist positions. It was almost perfect. Almost. The waist gunner pivoted with a speed that surprised even himself. His boots slid across the metal floor. His shoulder harness tightened. He twisted the machine gun toward the rear window as the Ju-88 streaked past in a slight downward arc. He fired before the sights fully aligned. The burst cut across the enemy fighter's left engine. Flames erupted immediately, bright and violent, as the engine tore itself apart. The German aircraft didn't break. It disintegrated, folding inward as the fire consumed its structure. Only one Ju-88 remained. The sixth fighter had never entered the fray. It had hung back, circling like a predator waiting for weakness. Now, with its formation shattered and 5 aircraft destroyed or forced away, the last pilot made his move. He dove from high above, coming in at tremendous speed. It was a final, desperate attack, a straight, unbroken dive aimed directly at the bomber's wing. The waist gunner tracked him. He led the angle. He compensated for speed, drift, and distance. But he didn't fire. Not yet. The fighter came closer. Faster. Locked onto the bomber like an arrow. The waist gunner waited until the final half-second when the dive tightened into a predictable line. Then he unleashed everything. The .50 caliber thundered, a solid, unbroken stream of fire cutting upward. The tracers walked across the diving fighter. First the wing, then the canopy, then the entire nose. The Ju-88 didn't pull out. It couldn't. It sheared past the bomber, missing the wing by less than 20 feet, trailing flames and smoke until it erupted in a sudden, violent blast. The sky went silent. The attack was over. The sky behind the bomber stream was still shifting, settling unevenly after the violence of the last few minutes. The waist gunner remained at his station, breathing hard but steady, his hands still locked around the grips of the .50 caliber gun. He didn't relax, not yet. Experience had taught American crews that the moments after an attack were often as dangerous as the attack itself. Lone fighters sometimes looped around for revenge passes. Wounded aircraft made desperate final strikes. And scattered formations could hide a straggler waiting for an opening. So he kept scanning. The bomber vibrated beneath his boots as the formation tightened, engines humming in a synchronized rhythm. Through the open window, cold air tore past him, carrying the lingering scent of burned fuel from the destroyed Ju-88s. He could still see fragments drifting in the distance, pieces of wings, pieces of engines, and pieces of a battle that, minutes earlier, had threatened to tear through the bomber stream. The waist gunner didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every man in the B-24 knew what he had done. They had heard the tone of his bursts, the rapid corrections, and the unmistakable sound of enemy cannons going silent one by one. The tail gunner had caught glimpses of the destruction, and the radio operator was already relaying partial confirmations from other aircraft in the formation. But the fight wasn't entirely over. Far behind, nearly invisible against the haze, something moved. The waist gunner leaned out slightly. The object was small. It wasn't climbing or aligning for another attack. It was descending. A Ju-88, badly damaged, falling in a slow, wobbling pattern. Smoke trailed behind it in a thin spiral. This was one of the fighters he had hit earlier. A crippled aircraft, losing altitude and spiraling away from combat. The waist gunner tracked it for a moment, long enough to confirm it posed no further threat, then turned back toward the formation. That was when he noticed something else. His own bomber was wounded. The earlier 20mm burst from the 5th Ju-88 had done more than shake the tail section. The round had torn through structural plating near the rear of the fuselage. Shrapnel had cut a small but dangerous line through the control cables along the left side. The bomber wasn't in immediate danger of breaking apart, but the pilots would feel the effects during any sharp maneuver or turbulence. The waist gunner called it out. The pilots acknowledged, adjusting their inputs to counter the slight pull in the controls. The bomber held formation, but only just. Every adjustment now required more force, more precision, more attention from the cockpit. The waist gunner understood what that meant. Their protection depended on staying inside the formation. Leaving it, even by accident, would expose the wounded aircraft to any additional fighters in the area. And the Luftwaffe rarely sent only 6. There were often more circling, more climbing, or more waiting along the bomber stream routes. He tightened his grip on the machine gun and resumed scanning. Minutes passed. Slow, heavy, tense. The waist compartment remained alive with vibration, a constant reminder that the bomber had survived, but not unscathed. The gunner rotated the barrel slowly, checking every direction. His muscles were tired, but fatigue was a luxury he didn't acknowledge. Then the radio crackled with urgency. New contacts. Fast movers. Rear sector. The waist gunner's heart kicked, but his mind didn't waver. He swung the gun toward the rear quarter. The sky stretched in a wide, pale expanse. Nothing obvious. Nothing closing. He saw them, but not fighters. American P-47s. They sliced through the sky from the southwest, angled upward into the bomber stream's altitude. Their silhouettes were unmistakable, bold, wide-winged, and fast. They approached with the raw confidence of escort fighters arriving exactly when needed. The waist gunner exhaled, not in relief, but in readiness. Escort fighters often drew enemy aircraft out of hiding. Sometimes their arrival encouraged wounded attackers to make one final pass before fleeing. The gunner stayed locked in position, watching for any lingering threats. But none came. The sky around the bomber stream remained clear. The P-47s climbed through the formation, spreading out to take over the defense. The waist gunner felt the shift instantly. The tension in the formation eased. The pilots steadied their grip. The crew's breathing slowed back into a rhythm more familiar than the frantic edge of combat. Only then did the waist gunner loosen his stance. He kept one hand on the gun's grip, the other resting gently on the ammo box. His arms ached from recoil. His shoulders burned from the strain of holding position during the attack. But his mind stayed sharp, reliving the sequence, the patterns of movement, the timing, the sound of the .50 caliber leveling the attack one fighter at a time. 5 attackers directly driven off or destroyed. The 6th forced to break away in flames. A bomber saved because a single gunner reacted faster than 6 coordinated enemy fighters. The climax of the battle wasn't the destruction of the final Ju-88. It was the moment the bomber stream realized they were still alive. And the reason was standing alone beside an open window, gripping a hot, smoking machine gun, surrounded by spent shell casings that covered the floor like brass gravel. When the sky finally steadied and the bomber stream regained its rhythm, the waist gunner stepped back from his position. His gloves were scorched at the fingertips, the metal grips still radiating heat from the relentless bursts he'd fired. Brass casings rolled beneath his boots as the B-24 held its place in formation, engines straining against the damage inflicted during the attack. The radio operator relayed reports drifting through the intercom network, multiple confirmations from nearby Liberators, fragmented but consistent. The formation had witnessed the engagement. They saw the sudden eruption of flame as the 6th Ju-88 fell away. They saw 2 others spin out of formation before disappearing. They saw one disintegrate mid-dive under the waist gunner's fire. And the rest, those that escaped, were last spotted diving at steep angles, trailing smoke, unable to continue combat. Word spread quickly through the bomber stream. Crewmen from other aircraft called out on the radio. Waist gunner on Yellow 3 got 2 for sure. Maybe 3. Tell that kid he saved the whole left column. The B-24's pilot didn't join the chatter, but he didn't need to. His voice carried a different weight when he keyed the intercom. Waist, good work. Stay alert. It was the highest praise a gunner could receive in mid-mission, direct acknowledgement from the cockpit. No excitement, no embellishment, just factual validation from the man responsible for keeping the bomber in the air. Still, the damage to their own aircraft remained a reality. The earlier cannon strike had torn open a shallow, jagged line across the fuselage. A control cable had frayed dangerously, and a section of the rear structure carried a dent deep enough to disrupt airflow. The pilots compensated with heavier inputs, and the bomber drifted slightly to the right no matter how tightly they held the controls. In combat, this kind of wound was survivable. On the return flight home, it was a liability. The waist gunner understood that the danger wasn't gone. At this altitude, over enemy territory, a wounded aircraft inherently drew attention. Enemy flak crews prioritized damaged bombers, knowing they were easier to hit and harder to maneuver. Fighter groups observed wounded planes as potential stragglers, and stragglers were the easiest prey of all. But the bombers stayed in formation. The escorting P-47s settled into their protective arc. Their presence alone shifted the dynamic of the mission. The Luftwaffe rarely risked additional intercepts when American fighters were overhead, especially after losing multiple aircraft in a single engagement. Inside the B-24, the adrenaline slowly drained. The waist gunner leaned against the frame, letting the cold wind cool the sweat beneath his flight jacket. His arms felt heavy. The recoil had pushed his muscles beyond exhaustion, and the tension of the attack had left his senses vibrating with residual shock. He replayed the engagement in his mind, not from pride, but from instinct, checking his mistakes, noting his corrections, analyzing each burst as though preparing for a report he would have to give later. That was how gunners stayed alive. They remembered everything. They improved in real time. They never assumed the next attack would go the same way. He didn't know how many German fighters he had downed personally. He didn't care. What mattered was that the bomber was still flying. What mattered was that the 6 Ju-88s never reached firing distance. What mattered was that the formation remained intact, and the mission continued. As the Liberators pushed deeper into friendly airspace, the waist gunner finally allowed his shoulders to ease and his breathing to level. The immediate threat had passed, but the echoes of the battle lingered in the cabin, in the curls of smoke drifting from the gun barrel, in the scattered casings at his feet, and in the quiet acknowledgement that every man aboard had seen how close they had come. The bomber wasn't safe yet. But because of him, it was still airborne. The bomber stream crossed back over the frontier hours later, escorted tightly by P-47s and P-51s rotating in from forward bases. By the time they approached the English coastline, the tension inside the B-24 had thinned into a heavy, silent fatigue. No one spoke much over the intercom except for essential updates. After the chaos of the earlier attack, silence felt like a form of luxury. The waist gunner cleaned his weapon as the bomber descended toward its home field. It wasn't protocol, not yet, but habit. The simple, mechanical process gave his mind something steady to hold onto. Thumb the charging handle. Reset the feed tray. Sweep away the powder residue. He checked the barrel's cooling jacket, tracing the heat-scored metal where it had glowed under sustained fire. When the wheels finally touched down, the landing gear rattled under the strain of damage absorbed during the mission. The pilots brought the bomber to a steady roll along the tarmac, fighting against the subtle pull caused by the wounded fuselage. Ground crews jogged alongside the aircraft before it came to a stop, waving for confirmation of casualties or system failures. The moment the engines shut down, the world shifted from vibration to stillness. The waist gunner stepped onto the runway, boots hitting the ground with a weight he hadn't felt since the mission began. Ground crewmen gathered near the rear fuselage, staring at the ragged tear left by the Ju-88's cannon burst. One mechanic ran his hand along the damaged line and muttered a quiet whistle. "You're lucky this didn't cut clean through," he said, half to himself. The gunner didn't answer. He wasn't thinking about the damage. His mind was still replaying the fight, the shapes of the approaching aircraft, the angles he chose, the moments where timing made the difference between survival and disaster. Inside the debriefing room, the air smelled of paper, ink, and lingering sweat from returning crews. Officers logged each aircraft's damage, ammunition expenditure, and enemy encounters. The waist gunner sat with his crew as their turn approached, hands resting on his knees, boots streaked with soot from the waist compartment floor. When the intelligence officer asked for the gunner's account, he gave it in simple, factual terms. There was no dramatizing, no exaggeration. The 6 Ju-88s approached from the rear sector. First burst broke the lead attack. Follow-on fighters attempted staggered vectors. I engaged each as they crossed into range. The officer asked how many he believed he hit. The gunner paused, then answered with the only number that mattered to him. All of them were stopped. Other crews from the formation later submitted similar reports. Some claimed they saw 2 fighters go down directly under his bursts. Others insisted they saw 3. Tail gunners from neighboring Liberators confirmed at least 4 breaking off in visible distress. But every account, from pilots, gunners, and observers, agreed on one point. The B-24 would not have survived the attack without the waist gunner's rapid action. His total confirmed kills would eventually be logged through post-mission analysis, but the quiet recognition in the debriefing room carried more weight than any formal tally. The pilots of his own aircraft spoke up before leaving the room. He held the entire left side, the co-pilot said. Saved the formation's rear column, the navigator added. The gunner didn't respond. Praise wasn't what he carried away from the mission. What stayed with him was the knowledge that in the most critical seconds, when 6 coordinated fighters bore down on their bomber, he had acted with clarity, accuracy, resolve. The kind of resolve that kept an entire crew alive. That night, as the men dispersed across the dispersal huts, the waist gunner sat alone for a moment outside the barracks, listening to the quiet hum of distant engines and the cold wind blowing across the field. His gloves still smelled faintly of burnt powder. The memory of the attack lingered behind his eyes, vivid and unbroken. The war would continue. The missions would continue. And so would the threats. But today, because of one gunner's reflexes, discipline, and unbroken nerve, a bomber returned home that otherwise would have been lost. The mission faded into the long record of the air war, one among thousands flown over Europe. But for the men of that B-24, and for the waist gunner who had stood in the open doorway of death, the memory never softened. It became one of those moments aircrews carried with them long after the engines cooled, long after the war turned and momentum shifted, long after victory became inevitable instead of uncertain. What made it endure was not the number of enemy aircraft destroyed, nor the dramatic nature of the attack. It was the simplicity of what happened. A single American gunner, presented with an impossible situation, reacted with instinct sharpened by training, discipline, and the quiet understanding that 9 other men were depending on him. In the vast machinery of the war, bomber streams stretching for miles, factories operating without pause, strategies crafted by generals and presidents, survival often depended on individuals who held their ground in the smallest corners of combat. Waist positions, tail turrets, nose compartments, cold, cramped spaces where airmen learned to live with danger as intimately as breath. The waist gunner's moment was one of those fragments of history that rarely make headlines but define the reality of the air war. It showed how American crewmen, even the youngest and least experienced, carried the burden of protecting their aircraft with a level of responsibility far beyond their age. It showed how quick thinking, steady nerve, and technical mastery of a .50 caliber gun could shift the outcome of an entire engagement. And it showed, unmistakably, how thin the line was between loss and survival in the skies over Europe. Long after the Liberator was repaired and returned to the line, the story lived on in the quiet recognition of those who knew what had happened, the pilots who trusted the guns behind them, the crews who watched the attack unfold, and the gunners who understood how rare it was for a bomber to escape such odds intact. One man, one reflexive decision, one burst of fire that turned 6 attackers away. And because of that, a crew flew again.